Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the drones that the Russians have started using in the Ukraine war, specifically the ones that are imported from Iran. Now, there's three big takeaways here. Number one, we're now getting a front row seat to find out just how collapsed the entire industrial base in the Russian system is. You know, this at one point was the second most powerful manufacturing power in the world at the height of the Soviet Empire in the 1960s. And now they are reliant upon what are basically flying mopeds from a country that has been under sanctions for 30 years and is a technological leader in nothing. It would be very easy in the West for us to retrofit a third-grade auto facility to produce things like this, and the Russians clearly cannot do it themselves, not at scale individually. And when you look at some of their advanced weapon systems that we've all been hearing about for years that at least on paper look really good, the Russians have had to hand make some of the new fighter bombers to the tune of one a year because that's all they can manage. So getting dozens and maybe even hundreds of drones from the Iranians all of a sudden is one of their more viable options for resupply. And that's kind of embarrassing. Second, the problems have a problem with leverage. Now, in the ongoing American-Iranian saga, I mean, the two sides don't get along, they haven't for a long time, but the Iranians have always kind of reserved the right to bring the Russians into the mix in order to disrupt things. And the Russians have always stuck their nose into relations between the Americans and the Iranians whenever it looks like the two of them might actually get along for a change in order to keep that alive. All of a sudden, it's Iran that has all the leverage because, yes, the Iranians are providing weapons to Iran, to a country that honestly should not have a problem making these themselves. But the question is, how do you compensate the Russians for them? And the best guess from what we've seen so far is the Russians have promised to launch a satellite for Iran, which, these drones go for about 20 grand a pop. So paying for a few dozen to a few hundred drones with a satellite launch to give Iran a fundamentally new capacity? Wow, that is not an equitable trade, but it's really all the Russians have on offer. I mean, what else are the Russians going to send Iran? Oil? Please. Third and finally, there's the question of war crimes. Now, the Iranian weapons are not very sophisticated. They can't pick their own targets. They can't dodge. You basically program in some coordinates and they take off. They fly at a relatively stable altitude and they basically go in a straight line from the point of launch to the point of detonation, which means that every single thing that the Russians hit was either something they were aiming for specifically or something that just happened to get in the way because it was too tall. So usually the former rather than the latter. And because these things move so slowly, only about 60 to 100 miles an hour, and because they're so loud, then they can be downed by a small arms fire, the Russians have been launching them in groups of at least 6, sometimes it's up to 20, just to make sure that at least one of them gets to the end location. Look at the targets that the Russians have been choosing. Glass bridges, power plants, apartment blocks, things that are absolutely 100% not military targets. That tells us two things. Number one, they're not just deliberately committing war crimes. They're programming those same coordinates in 5, 10, 20 times to make sure they hit the target, which is about as deliberate as war crimes can get. Second, there are almost no reports of the Russians targeting military targets. Now, military targets evolve, and so in order to hit a building that has what you want, you need some intelligence. That's probably why the Russians aren't going after them, because they have none. Their satellite reconnaissance is not working, or at least it's not being communicated to the people who are launching these assaults. They don't have fighter or reconnaissance plane cover at all. And their drones aren't good enough with optics and range to provide them with the basic information they need for military targeting. So all that's left is civilian targeting. Now, for the Ukrainians, this is the best and the worst of all worlds. The worst is obvious. What's vulnerable are buildings that are of civilian make that, can't move, and they're the same thing every day. On the good side, it does mean that any logistical depots that the Ukrainians have are, I don't want to say immune to Russian assaults, but heavily resistant because the Russians are demonstrating they don't have sufficient battlefield logistical intelligence to even provide some base targeting profiles. That would seem to suggest that at least for the remainder of this year and maybe into the first quarter of next year, that Ukraine absolutely has flipped the balance of forces when it comes to deep strike options, despite the fact that it still doesn't have nearly as much heavy equipment or aircraft as the Russians have. The Russians are just unable to leverage what they have, assuming it works at all. For the Ukrainians, this is the best and worst of all worlds. The worst is obvious. Ukrainian buildings don't move. Civilian assets don't move. They don't change day to day. So that's what the Russians are capable of targeting. That's what they're going after. On the best, military equipment does move. What logistical depot or arms depot is important one day is not necessarily important the next. And that requires actual intelligence to provide the targeting coordinates that the other side needs in order to mess up your military operations. It is clear that the Russians lack the capacity to do that. So even though the Russians still have a lot more men and equipment, with certainly a lot more men on the way, at least for the next few months, the Ukrainians actually have better deep strike capacity because they have eyes on the ground, either directly through their human operations or indirectly through the Americans. And when it comes down to making sure that every shot counts, that's what you need. But there's been a lot that has developed over the last 48 hours, so I feel I need to do a quick update. The biggest thing to understand is not only is China now unable to import the equipment to make semiconductors, or the tools to maintain and operate the equipment, or the software that's necessary to operate the equipment, or any mid or high-level chips at all. Now, any Americans who want to assist with the Chinese semiconductor industry have to make a choice. You can have your job with China, or you can have your citizenship. As a result, within about 48 hours of the policy being adopted last Friday, every single American citizen who was working in China in the industry either quit or their companies relocated their entire division so they wouldn't have to lose their staff. For all practical purposes, the Chinese semiconductor industry of everything over like Internet of Things level of quality is now dead. And that has a lot more implications than it sounds. The Chinese have proven incapable over the last 25 years of advancing sufficiently technologically in terms of the intellectual heft that's required to operate this industry beyond being able to simply operate the facilities that make the low-end chips, and even that had to be managed by foreigners. So there is no indigenous capacity here to pick this up and move on. And since the United States has basically corralled the Japanese and the Dutch, two very pro-American countries from a strategic sense, to join in this ban, really all that's left is potentially Korea and Taiwan, and even if they were fully on board, which they're not, that is not enough to carry all the water that needs to be carried. In terms of industrial follow-on, this doesn't just mean that the Chinese are never going to be able to make the chips that go into cars or computers. It also means that any industry that is dependent upon the hardware dies. So when you think of some of the technological advancement that the Chinese have made in recent years, things like AI and mass automation, monitoring their own population, the Great Firewall, hypersonic cruise missiles, a space program, supercomputers. If the Chinese want to do any of this, they have to buy chips basically on the gray market, purchase pre-finished products, and then pull out the chips and apply them to something they weren't designed for. We are looking at least an order of magnitude drop in the Chinese capacity to operate in anything that is tech-focused. This is a deal killer, not just for the industry, but for a modern technocratic system. From a technological point of view, China is done. The question, of course, is what do they do about it? We are dealing with a one-man government here that's a little petulant when they don't get their way, and where the bureaucracy is either completely static or over-enthusiastic and does things like wolf warrior diplomacy. So I would expect this kind of bag-of-dicks diplomacy that has evolved in China to get this hard and loud, which will probably only encourage the Americans to act more harshly and start targeting some of the lower-end semiconductors. And that's going to have consequences throughout the world, but we'll get to that.